Let me show you some good and some bad to start this off, and then we'll fill in the gaps. Rainbow Six Siege runs great using competitive settings, and the difference between PCIe 4 and PCIe 3 is minimal. Shadow of the Tomb Raider runs 1080p medium settings at 60 FPS. Now, when I change the textures from medium to high, bam, 20% of my FPS just went down the drain. And this is Wolfenstein Youngblood, high preset running on Linux with smart access memory enabled using PCIe 4. Great visuals and excellent frame pacing. In this video, I don't just want to show you how the card does in benchmarks using various configurations. I want to report on my experience with the card and what I've learned about it. Because sometimes the difference between the GPU doing poorly and doing just fine is a single setting. I use two test systems. For PCIe 3 testing, I use my dear Ryzen 5 5600G, and for PCIe 4 testing, I ripped the Ryzen 9 5900X out of my server. However, I disabled half the cores on the 5900X, so think of it as a 5600G that had one too many energy drinks. I used the same 16GB DDR4 3200 CL14 RAM, the same B550 motherboard and cooler for both setups. Because I tested this on an all AMD platform, I didn't just want to benchmark PCIe revisions, but also try Smart Access Memory SAM on versus off. This is a setting you can enable in the BIOS and will let the CPU address GPU's VRAM in chunks greater than 256 MB. I was skeptical about the narrow X4 interface on the Radeon 6500 XT, but most of you guys seem to think on is better. I'm just going to flick by the benchmark charts here and give you the conclusion. As expected, the PCIe 4 platform always beat PCIe 3. In some cases it was close, in others not so much. Smart Access Memory can improve performance marginally. However, sometimes the performance regressed and in some cases it completely tanked. So I can't recommend you turn SAM on by default on the RX 6500 XT. But I suspect this comes down to the narrow PCIe interface combined with the limited VRAM. I know you guys want to see the gameplay footage. I did the most extensive testing, around 40 games using the 5600G on Windows 10, but I retested around 10 games using PCIe 4, and I suspected or knew there would be a difference based on the benchmarks. I also tried some games on PopOS Linux to round this out, primarily those I knew would perform worse or very well. I benchmarked Assassin's Creed Odyssey on the medium preset, but the RX 6500 XT is on the top end of graphics card that I will test on this set of games and settings. So I recommend the high preset but turning clouds down to low. This allows for a mostly 60 FPS experience on PCIe 3, while on PCIe 4 we see a drop below 60 FPS rarely. Running very high or ultra high settings cause the frame rate to tank horribly. In Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition we are CPU limited on the Ryzen 5600G, but I don't think anybody will be bothered by this given that we are pushing over 300 FPS. Of course this will drop in super busy skirmishes and late game, but the 6500 XT certainly isn't the problem here. Apex Legends ran great. On the low end I saw 100 FPS, but the frame rate went up to 150. The only time it drops below 100 FPS using competitive settings is during the jump phase in the beginning. Because this ran perfectly smooth and wasn't close to maxing out the VRAM, I didn't see a reason to test with the PCIe 4 system. A Plague Tale Innocence starts in one of the heaviest areas. On the Ultra preset we managed just about 60 FPS, but I played through half the game in a single sitting using the Vega 7, and I know that 30 FPS is more than satisfactory in this game. So I want to push it a bit harder. The game has a resolution scale slider that can go over 100%. So I set it to 140, that's more pixels than 1440p, and I locked the frame rate to 30 using a Radeon Chill. Look at the frame time graph, super smooth and the image is incredibly sharp. We've seen Batman Arkham City in the benchmarks, but I want to have an in-game look. Unlike the benchmark, the game seems to be limited to 90 FPS. Again, frame pacing was perfect here, as you can see in the overlay. The GPU utilization was only around 70% on maxed out settings. I want to get Borderlands 3 into my test rotation, but Borderlands 2 has to do it for now. This is a DX9 game and I suspect the game engine may limit us in some cases, but for the most part this runs in the 100 to 200 FPS range at maxed settings. The drops below 100 FPS also occur on the PCIe 4 system. Watching the GPU utilization shows that the RX 6500 XT doesn't appear to be the limiting factor during those dips, as the VRAM usage is pretty low. I ran Remedy's control on medium but disabled MSAA and global reflections and instead increased texture filtering to the highest setting. The 6500 XT on PCIe 3 maintained 60 FPS for the most part without showing any severe pacing issues. Again, you can see that I dialed in those settings to come in below 4 GB of VRAM. On the PCIe 4 system, I also tested the new Radeon Super Resolution feature. This uses a similar technique as FSR, but applies indiscriminately to the entire image, including HUD elements. Here I scaled the image up from 1080p to 4K. I'm running the same settings, but I turned MSAA on because this will give us a nicer result when upscaling and sharpening. CSGO runs as expected. I was using all low settings and I'm not running all low for the benefit of this card. It could undoubtedly handle higher settings almost as well. I want to run the competitive games on the competitive graphics settings. However, 2Clicks Phillips found that when using PCIe 3, some of the newer maps don't run as well. I will leave a link to his video in the description. As you may have noticed in the benchmarks, Cyberpunk 2077 doesn't agree with the PCIe Gen 3 6500 XT. Turning the settings down to low and using older quality FSR helped, but it wasn't good enough for 60 FPS. I got it to drop below 30 FPS in Lizzie's bar. But here's the same scene on PCIe Gen 4, and it's running on higher settings. For the closest to 60 FPS experience, I think going with the low preset but enabling screen space reflections and ambient occlusion to their lowest non-off values and turning texture filtering up to X4 is the way to go. While not using FSR, this will still leave us a hair away from 60 FPS. However, with older quality FSR, I think it's best to go for medium but turn SSR down from medium to low. In this scenario, high-speed driving through the busier city parts can drop the frame rate into the 40s, but you see up to 90 FPS in the back alleys. Now, Destiny 2 ran great on the PCIe Gen 3 platform, and the frame rate stayed between 75 and 125 using high settings. Here the anti-cheat software blocks the RTSS overlay, so you only get that tiny FPS number in the top right corner and no frame time graph, but I can report that this felt smooth throughout my little rampage. I added Doom 2016 specifically to test Vulkan vs OpenGL. Running at maxed settings, the 6500 XT performed great using either backend. In terms of FPS, Vulkan seemed to do a bit better, but OpenGL wasn't far off. Emulators can use OpenGL, but the only one I'm personally familiar with, RPCS3, supports and recommends Vulkan anyway. Doom Eternal was fascinating. The 6500 XT can push high FPS, but on PCIe Gen 3 it only does it on the low preset, and the medium preset cuts the frame rate below half in some cases. The medium preset ran fine on Windows using PCIe Gen 4, but the high preset was no good. The frame rate on Linux using PCIe Gen 4 was better and smoother than on Windows when using the high preset. I'd rather play Doom Eternal at 120 FPS on low settings than 60 to 80 FPS on the high graphics settings, but you will have your preferences. DOTA 2 poses no challenge for the 6500 XT. 200 FPS at maxed out graphics settings makes it hard to complain. But let me try. The frame times are not perfect. That's all I can say about this. Next. Elden Ring. I know you guys like Elden Ring. And I like Elden Ring. And Elden Ring seems to like the RX 6500 XT. Well, at least it doesn't hate it. On PCIe Gen 3, medium settings seem to be the best option if you want a near perfect 60 FPS that rarely drops. Although blitzing around on torrent can lead to some dips, that manifests as temporary slowdowns and not as terrible stuttering. Also, 1440p can be played on the maximum preset at a locked 30 FPS. On PCIe 4 we get a nice boost. We frequently dip below 60 frames per second on the maximum preset, but on the high preset with an overclock on the Radeon 6500 XT we get a lock on 60 FPS. I'd go for high, but there's nothing wrong with the maximum setting. Fortnite ran well, and I tested DirectX 11 and DirectX 12. The 6500 XT did an excellent job using either, but I'd give a slight edge to DX12. I used competitive settings, all low except for the draw distance. I didn't retest this on PCIe 4, but I had no reason to assume there would be a meaningful difference. I could be wrong. But either way, Fortnite runs excellent. Using PCIe Gen 3, I played Forza Horizon 5 on the medium preset. As you can see, this resulted in a solid frame rate. But you're right up against that 4GB VRAM cliff. It may be more appropriate to call it a VRAM abyss on PCIe 3. You can tweak the settings a bit here, just increase stuff that doesn't require VRAM but only compute. On Gen 4, the high preset gave me a VRAM warning, but it still ran great. I was surprised, but the ultra preset was no good, dropping our frame rate from the 90s into the 40s. That's not worth it, and the frame pacing was horrible. Genshin Impact is child's play for the 6500 XT. I maxed out the settings and increased the resolution scale above 100%. Still, it ran perfectly smooth at 60 frames per second. I hear there are heavier areas, but I doubt this will be a problem, and you can always turn the res scale back to 100%. I ran God of War on the original quality preset, but increased model quality to high and texture filtering to ultra. On the Gen 4 platform, I'd run it at 21:9 without FSR or 16:9 with ultra quality FSR, but it can still drop below 60 FPS. It did better using the same settings on Gen 4, only very rarely dropping below 60 FPS, and overall this was very pleasant. The game looks beautiful at slightly upwards tweaked original preset. My GTA 5 benchmark settings include MSAA, but I'd instead max out everything else and turned MSA off. And I never saw it drop below 60 FPS, even on the 5600G. But usually the frame rate was closer to 80 or over. The frame pacing was smooth, and I didn't experience a single annoying frame drop. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice isn't the most popular game, and it only takes about 8 hours to complete, but there's a good reason I'm testing it and will keep testing it. And no, it's not just because I like it. This Unreal Engine 4 game runs in DX11, DX12. It also supports ray tracing, DLSS, and FSR. Using PCIe Gen 3, I went with maxed out settings, which worked great and allowed me a flawless 60 FPS experience. But I tried ray tracing on the Gen 4 platform, which was disappointing. And it wasn't disappointing because it was flat out horrible. It was disappointing because it almost worked well enough. Sometimes it would work well, even running at around 60 FPS when there were ray traced reflections on the screen, but then sometimes it just completely tanked and dropped to 20 FPS. I tried all sorts of FSR levels and preset settings to reduce VRAM requirements, but I couldn't make it work consistently. I forgot to record footage using the PCIe 3 system here. Anyway, Horizon Zero Dawn is one of the benchmark games, so you can gauge the performance difference from the difference in the benchmarks. This runs reasonably close to 60 FPS in my preferred in-game test spot. It's not quite 60, but most of the game is easier to run than this area. I also tested this on Linux because I knew that it would be worse. The performance hit was in the expected range of slightly over 10%. The extreme performance hit caused by smart access memory also persisted under Linux, which was good because it means I probably didn't screw up my Windows test setup. Kingdom Come Deliverance runs on the Cry engine, and it worked great on the RX 6500 XT paired with the Ryzen 5600G. The high preset seems ideal. Not only is the frame rate at 60 or better most of the time, but it also doesn't overdraw the VRAM budget either, even with HD textures enabled. You can use higher settings, but your FPS will drop hard, at least on PCIe Gen 3. 60 FPS at high or 30 FPS at very high. That's not a hard decision. In League of Legends, my GPU just took a little nap. It was barely doing any work and still pushing over 200 FPS. The card did a great job. I, however, performed poorly. I cancelled my auto twice and missed out on the kill on this Mondo. Metro Exodus ran well. I didn't record the settings and didn't make a note here, sorry, but I believe it's the high graphics quality and 16x filtering. On the PCIe 4 platform, I also tried ray tracing in combination with Radeon Super Resolution. At a 40% shading rate on the medium graphics quality setting, the frame rate can go into the 20s. Still, if you want to experience ray tracing and play around a bit, it's good enough for that, but otherwise it's not worth it. The only reason I tested Minecraft is because of ray tracing. At 720p this runs well enough to be playable. It's sitting around 40 FPS and you can also see that the reflection in the lake is ray traced because it doesn't disappear when I move the camera down, and the reflected object goes off screen. I maxed out PAYDAY 2, and it was still a fantastic experience. The overlay bugged out on me here, but the frame time graph is still working. The frame times are between 5 and 6.5 milliseconds for the most part, so between 160 and 200 frames per second. Quake 2 RTX was another ray trace test. This also seems to be playable at 40 to 50 FPS when using a 720p render resolution, and going even lower than that might be worth it to get a smooth 60. And let's face it, when Quake 2 was released, 600 by 400 pixels was a good resolution. Rainbow Six Siege runs precisely as the benchmark led us to believe. This is smooth 200ish FPS, about 3 times faster than the Vega 7 in the 5600G. Speaking of the 5600G, it doesn't break a sweat keeping up with the frame rate. I ran Red Dead Redemption 2 using the console settings as determined by Digital Foundry. Going into this, I was a bit worried, but I'm happy to report that Red Dead runs great. On the PCIe 3 platform, we can get the occasional dip below 60 FPS. However, overclocking the 6500 XT does the trick. My card allows me to push another 15% power, around 250 MHz on the VRAM and core clock. I didn't have any trouble with the overclocks, it was completely stable. The only difference on my XFX card was that it went from practically inaudible to just about noticeable. I also tested this game with PCIe 4, even without the GPU overclock it performs about 10 to 15% better, so a bit more headroom for cranking up settings. I started with increasing texture filtering and adding a bit of sharpening. Overall, I was extremely pleased with the unexpectedly good results here. You've seen Shadow of the Tomb Raider in the intro, so you know that going with the high preset is probably a bad idea, and that's just how it is on the PCIe Gen 3 system. When I say it's a bad idea, what I mean is that it's not a good trade-off in terms of performance and visuals. You can certainly run it, you just give up a disproportionate amount of FPS. On the PCIe 4 platform, performance improves, but more importantly, running the high preset doesn't cause the frame rate to drop as hard. You can even go for ray traced shadows, but using the medium setting doesn't look too much different than regular shadows, and the high setting kills about 33% of our FPS. Still, if you want to experience some more ray tracing at playable frame rates, it's an option with this card. I tested Team Fortress 2 in a bot match, and I maxed out the settings and ran it at 4K, which resulted in over 150 FPS. The frame rate was sky high, but the frame pacing was also super smooth. I tested 1080p, but that seemed to be CPU or engine limited at around 250 FPS, at least in the bot match. In Valorant, I again used competitive settings. Because of the limited overlay, I can't say whether we were CPU or GPU limited when using the Ryzen 5600G, but it rarely drops below 300 FPS and mostly sits in the mid 300s, reaching over 400 in some cases. I never tried to run Warframe at high settings before, so I was a bit surprised that I had to max this out to give the 6500 XT a workout. I don't think it ever dropped below 150 FPS, and the frame pacing was buttery smooth. I assume there will be some harder to run areas later in the game, but I don't have those. I only play it for testing, so if you want to see me play late game areas, you'll have to wait a couple of years. I tried something different in Witcher 3. I went with the Ultra preset including NVIDIA Hairworks, and also used the highest ambient occlusion option and anti-aliasing on the post-processing screen. So basically I ran silly settings. I then locked the frame rate to 60 and it was smooth. Only in my particular brothel spot I could make it drop, otherwise it was flawless. If you don't enable Hairworks, you can get 80 to 90 FPS. Last one, Wolfenstein Youngblood. I know this is not popular, but it has the same engine and assets as New Colossus. On the high preset, this is fantastic. The frame rate hovers around 120 on the PCIe 3 system. I also tested this on Linux, which ran great as well. I think we have to stick to the high preset or cook up some custom settings. The next higher preset would run us out of VRAM. So, is this card for you? Let me describe the perfect candidate for the RX 6500 XT to answer this question. The ideal RX 6500 XT user prefers higher frame rates over higher settings. They have a PCIe 4 capable system or plan on upgrading to one pretty soon. They have a 120Hz 1080p monitor. They don't need their GPU to have a hardware encoder for video recording, streaming, or editing. They don't mind tinkering with graphics settings to get the best result. For my needs, the deal breaker is the lack of an encoder, but it ultimately comes down to whether you're happy with the performance you get and the price in the market. I know that, although many of you guys don't have access to a robust second-hand market, so picking up a used GTX 1070 isn't an option. I hope I demonstrated what the RX 6500 XT is good at and what it isn't good at. If this video helped you, consider giving it a like. Thanks. I have a stack of graphics card I'm working through right now. Also, if you haven't heard yet, there will be a Radeon RX 6400, and I will try to get it as soon as it's available. Have a great day.